October 1914. As Europe descended into the chaos of the Great War, thousands of Bible students, followers of what would later become known as Jehovah's Witnesses, waited with bated breath for something far more dramatic than any earthly conflict. They weren't expecting metaphors or symbolic fulfillments. They believed governments would collapse, religious systems would crumble, and Christ would visibly assume control of the earth. Families had sold their possessions, quit their jobs, and gathered in anticipation of the most momentous event in human history. But the world didn't end. What happened next represents one of religious history's most fascinating case studies in prophetic failure and doctrinal adaptation. How did this date become the most important cornerstone of the religion to this day, even after the spectacular failure of its original predictions? How does a movement survive and even thrive when its foundational prophecy simply doesn't come to pass? More importantly, how does a failed prediction become the basis for claiming divine authority over millions of lives? This investigation exposes, step by step, how this prophecy was constructed, how it was reformulated to remain alive even after its bankruptcy, and why it continues to control the lives of millions more than a century later. The story of 1914 is not just about one failed prediction. It's about the machinery of religious control, the psychology of belief, and the tragic cost of building entire lives on prophetic foundations that were never solid to begin with. The date 1914 didn't emerge from thin air. It was the result of intricate calculations made by Charles Taze Russell, the founder of the movement. Born in 1852 into a Presbyterian family in Pittsburgh, Russell experienced an early crisis of faith that would shape his entire worldview. As a teenager working in his father's clothing store, he began questioning traditional Christian doctrines, particularly the concept of eternal hellfire. The idea that a loving God would torment people forever seemed incompatible with divine justice. This questioning led him on a spiritual journey that would culminate in the creation of an entirely new religious movement that would eventually span the globe. Russell wasn't content with simple Bible study. He was obsessed with chronology, the idea that human history followed a divine timetable that could be calculated and predicted with mathematical precision. This wasn't unusual for his era. The late 19th century was rife with prophetic speculation, date-setting, and apocalyptic expectations. The aftermath of the Civil War, rapid industrialization, and social upheaval created a fertile ground for those promising that divine intervention was imminent. What made Russell different was his systematic approach and his ability to weave together seemingly disparate elements into a compelling prophetic narrative that appeared both biblical and scientific. Russell drew heavily from the work of Nelson Barber, a fellow date-setter who had already developed some of the chronological frameworks Russell would later adopt and refine. Barber had pointed to 1874 as significant, and when that date passed without visible fulfillment, he reinterpreted it as the invisible presence of Christ. This concept of invisible fulfillment would become crucial to Russell's later reinterpretations of his own failed predictions. Based on interpretations of the book of Daniel, specifically the expression 7 times, Russell applied a peculiar chronological logic that would become the cornerstone of his entire prophetic system. He considered that the fall of Jerusalem occurred in 607 BCE, despite historical records indicating 587 BCE. This 20-year difference wasn't a minor detail. It was absolutely crucial to his calculations. From there, he added 2,520 prophetic years, arriving at 1914 as the end of the times of the Gentiles. The foundation of Russell's calculation rested on Daniel's reference to 7 times, a period mentioned in connection with Nebuchadnezzar's period of madness. Russell interpreted these 7 times as prophetic years, each year representing 360 days, for a total of 2,520 days. Then, applying the day for a year principle found elsewhere in biblical prophecy, he transformed these 2,520 days into 2,520 years. This wasn't arbitrary. Russell believed he had discovered a divine mathematical code hidden in Scripture that would reveal God's timetable for human history. But Russell didn't stop there. In what might seem like a bizarre tangent to modern readers, he also relied on pyramidology, believing that the internal measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza revealed prophetic truths. The measurements of the ascending passage supposedly had exact fulfillment in 1914. He called the pyramid God's stone witness, treating it with the same reverence he accorded to biblical prophecy. Russell became convinced that the Great Pyramid was not just an ancient monument, but what he called God's stone witness. He believed that the internal measurements of the pyramid, particularly the ascending passage, corresponded exactly to biblical chronology and confirmed his calculations about 1914. Russell spent considerable time and resources studying pyramid measurements, corresponding with pyramidologists, and incorporating their findings into his prophetic framework. The pyramid measurements seem to confirm not only 1914 as the end of the times of the Gentiles, but also other significant dates in Russell's system. The precision of these measurements, calculated down to inches and then converted to years, gave his followers an additional layer of confidence in the prophetic framework. This wasn't just biblical interpretation. This was scientific confirmation of divine prophecy. All of this gave the prophecy a mystical, exact, and unquestionable aura in the eyes of the faithful. In 1879, Russell began publishing Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence, a magazine that would become the primary vehicle for his teachings and eventually reach millions of readers worldwide. From the beginning, Russell's message was clear: we are living in the last days, and the end is calculable, imminent, and inevitable. The magazine's very title proclaimed Christ's invisible presence, a doctrine that would become central to Russell's reinterpretation of failed prophecy. Russell promoted this chronology relentlessly through multiple channels. In his 6-volume series Studies in the Scriptures, originally called Millennial Dawn, he laid out his prophetic system in exhaustive detail. These books were distributed by the millions, translated into multiple languages, and became the theological foundation for the growing Bible student movement. Volume 2, The Time is at Hand, published in 1889, contained his most detailed exposition of the 1914 calculation and became required reading for all serious Bible students. The confidence with which Russell promoted these dates was remarkable and unequivocal. In the 1889 edition of The Time is at Hand, he wrote that within the coming 26 years all present governments would be overthrown and dissolved. He wasn't speaking in conditional terms or offering vague possibilities. He was making specific, testable predictions that his followers could count on. This certainty was part of the appeal. In an uncertain world, Russell offered absolute assurance about the future. Russell's followers weren't passive recipients of these teachings. Many reorganized their entire lives around the 1914 expectation. Some sold their businesses, others postponed marriage or education, and many devoted their full attention to spreading Russell's message before the end arrived. The psychological investment in the 1914 date went far beyond intellectual agreement. It became the organizing principle of thousands of lives. When the First World War broke out in July 1914, many saw this as direct validation of the prophecy. After all, the world really seemed to be entering collapse. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, set off a chain of events that would engulf Europe in the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. For Russell's followers, this timing couldn't be coincidental. Here was their prophetic vindication unfolding before their eyes. Russell quickly published articles suggesting that the kingdom of God had begun invisibly in the heavens, and that earthly events were just beginning to align with this new reality. What was expected as something visible and catastrophic was being transformed into an invisible reign of Christ. This reinterpretation would prove to be one of the most significant theological innovations in the movement's history, providing a template for handling future prophetic failures. The psychological impact of this timing cannot be overstated. For Russell and his followers, the outbreak of war couldn't be mere coincidence. Here was visible, undeniable proof that their calculations had been correct. The world was indeed entering its final phase. The synchronicity between Russell's long-predicted date and the outbreak of global warfare provided powerful psychological validation that seemed to confirm divine orchestration. But there was a significant problem. The specific events Russell had predicted weren't happening according to schedule. Governments weren't being overthrown by divine intervention. The churches weren't being destroyed by supernatural means. The saints weren't being glorified and taken to heaven. Christ wasn't visibly establishing his kingdom on earth. Instead of divine intervention, there was just human warfare, terrible and bloody, but distinctly earthly in character. Russell's response to this challenge was masterful in its theological creativity and would establish a pattern that the organization would follow for decades to come. He didn't abandon his chronology. Instead, he reinterpreted it fundamentally. Yes, 1914 was significant, but not in the visible way originally expected. Instead, Christ had begun ruling invisibly in heaven, and the earthly turmoil was merely the beginning of the birth pangs of the new world. In articles published in the Watchtower throughout 1914 and 1915, Russell explained that the kingdom had been established, but in the spiritual realm where human eyes couldn't see. The Great War was evidence that Satan had been cast out of heaven and was now venting his fury on earth, knowing his time was short. What appeared to be prophetic failure was actually prophetic fulfillment, just not in the manner originally anticipated. This reinterpretation served multiple crucial purposes for the movement's survival. It preserved Russell's prophetic authority by demonstrating that he had been right about the timing, even if wrong about the specific manifestations. It maintained the significance of the 1914 date while explaining away the obvious discrepancies between expectation and reality. Most importantly, it established a precedent for reinterpreting prophetic expectations when reality didn't match predictions, creating a theological framework that could absorb virtually any failure. The psychological mechanism at work here is fascinating. Rather than abandoning their beliefs when faced with disconfirming evidence, Russell's followers experienced what psychologists would later term cognitive dissonance. The mental discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs was resolved not by abandoning the original prophecy, but by accepting the new interpretation that preserved the essential elements of their faith while explaining away the failures. After Russell's death in October 1916, his successor, Joseph Franklin Rutherford, continued the prophetic legacy with significant adjustments and innovations. Russell's death occurred just 2 years after his most famous prediction, leaving the movement in a vulnerable position. Rutherford, a Missouri lawyer who had served as the organization's legal counsel, maneuvered himself into the presidency of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society through a combination of legal maneuvering and political skill. Rutherford wasn't content to simply continue Russell's work. He wanted to put his own stamp on the movement and establish his own prophetic authority. He inherited Russell's chronological framework, but he also inherited its problems. The year 1914 had come and gone, and while it had been reinterpreted as significant, the original expectations had clearly failed. Many Bible students were becoming restless, and some were beginning to question the entire prophetic framework. Rutherford's solution was to extend the prophetic timeline with new dates and new expectations, while simultaneously centralizing authority in the organization itself. 1918 was announced as the year of judgment for Babylon, representing all false religions. This wasn't just theological speculation. Rutherford taught that the churches of Christendom would literally be destroyed during this year. When 1918 passed without the promised destruction, he quietly moved on to new predictions. 1925 became Rutherford's signature prophetic date. He taught that this would mark the return of the princes of antiquity, biblical figures such as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and David, who would be resurrected and return to earth to serve as visible rulers in God's kingdom. This wasn't spiritual or symbolic. Rutherford taught that these men would literally return to life and establish a visible government on earth. The 1925 prediction became particularly significant because Rutherford promoted it with even greater confidence than Russell had shown regarding 1914. In the book, Millions Now Living Will Never Die, published in 1920, he wrote that they could confidently expect that 1925 would mark the return of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the faithful prophets of old to the condition of human perfection. The title itself became a slogan that was displayed on billboards and distributed on millions of tracts worldwide. To prepare for their arrival, Rutherford even had a mansion built in San Diego, California, called Beth Sarim, meaning House of the Princes. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a concrete preparation for a literal fulfillment. The mansion was built with the best materials available, furnished lavishly, and deed restrictions were written to ensure it would be available for the returning biblical figures. Rutherford's confidence in the 1925 prediction was absolute. He organized massive conventions where hundreds of thousands of Bible students gathered to hear about the imminent resurrection. The movement's literature was filled with detailed explanations of what life would be like once the ancient worthies returned. Many followers sold their homes, quit their jobs, and made other major life decisions based on the certainty that 1925 would bring the promised fulfillment. None of these predictions were fulfilled. When 1925 came and went without any resurrections, without any visible princes, and without any fundamental change in the world order, the impact on the Bible student movement was severe and lasting. Many followers, who had already endured the reinterpretation of 1914 and the failure of 1918, finally lost faith and left the organization. The movement experienced significant schisms, with various groups breaking away to form independent Bible student associations that continue to exist today. But Rutherford's response was characteristic and would set the pattern for handling future prophetic failures. He doubled down on organizational authority while quietly backing away from date setting. He began emphasizing that only the organization could properly interpret biblical prophecy, and that individual members needed to submit to organizational direction even when they didn't understand it. The concept of theocratic order became central to the movement's identity. The Beth Sarim mansion became a source of considerable embarrassment. Rather than housing resurrected biblical figures, it became Rutherford's winter residence, where he lived in luxury while his followers struggled through the Great Depression. The organization eventually sold the property after Rutherford's death, quietly abandoning the doctrine that had justified its construction while never acknowledging the failed prediction that had prompted its building. This pattern of confident prediction, spectacular failure, quiet abandonment, and increased emphasis on organizational authority would become characteristic of the movement that was now beginning to call itself Jehovah's Witnesses. Each failed prediction was followed by a tightening of organizational control and an increased emphasis on loyalty to the organization rather than verification of its teachings. Today, more than a century later, 1914 is still the central pillar of Jehovah's Witness eschatology. They believe that Christ began to reign invisibly in the heavens in 1914, that this marked the beginning of the last days, and that the generation that witnessed the events of 1914 would be alive to see the end of the current system of things. However, this entire chronology depends on a single crucial date, 607 BCE as the year of Jerusalem's fall to the Babylonians. This dependency isn't a minor detail. It's the keystone that holds the entire prophetic arch together. If 607 BCE is wrong, then the calculation of 2,520 years leading to 1914 is wrong, and the entire theological framework that justifies the organization's authority collapses. The stakes couldn't be higher, which explains why the organization defends this date with such determination despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The historical evidence for 587/586 BCE as the date of Jerusalem's fall is not just strong. It's overwhelming and comes from multiple independent sources. Babylonian chronicles, cuneiform tablets discovered by archaeologists, provide detailed year-by-year accounts of Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns, including the siege and capture of Jerusalem. These aren't religious documents. They're administrative records kept by Babylonian scribes for governmental purposes. Ancient astronomical records provide additional confirmation. The Babylonians were meticulous observers of celestial events, recording eclipses, planetary positions, and other astronomical phenomena with precise dates. Modern astronomy can verify these observations with absolute accuracy, providing fixed points in ancient chronology that cannot be disputed. These astronomical texts consistently support the traditional chronology that places Jerusalem's fall in 587/586 BCE. Archaeological evidence from Jerusalem and other Judean sites provides physical confirmation of the destruction. Excavations have revealed destruction layers that can be dated to the late 6th century BCE through various scientific methods, including pottery analysis, carbon dating, and stratigraphic analysis. The archaeological evidence consistently supports the historical consensus. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, provides additional confirmation of the traditional chronology. While Josephus sometimes made errors in his historical work, his account of the Babylonian period aligns with other ancient sources and supports the 587/586 BCE date for Jerusalem's fall. Multiple ancient sources, including Egyptian records, Greek historians, and Persian documents, all provide chronological information that supports the traditional dating. The convergence of evidence from these diverse sources creates a chronological framework that historians and archaeologists accept with confidence. Despite this massive weight of evidence, Jehovah's Witnesses continue to insist on 607 BCE. Why? Because admitting error on this date would require abandoning 1914, which would, in turn, require restructuring the entire theological system that justifies the organization's authority. The organization has invested too much in the 1914 chronology to abandon it, regardless of the evidence. The organization's response to this challenge has been to attack the credibility of secular chronology while defending their own interpretation as divinely revealed truth. They argue that secular historians have been misled by incomplete or inaccurate records, while the Bible provides the only reliable chronological framework. This argument allows them to dismiss centuries of historical and archaeological research while maintaining their doctrinal position. The organization has even published detailed chronological charts and articles defending the 607 BCE date, but these defenses rely on selective use of evidence, misrepresentation of scholarly sources, and circular reasoning. When secular evidence contradicts their chronology, they simply dismiss it as unreliable. When it appears to support their position, they cite it as confirmation of their accuracy. Central to the entire 1914 calculation is the starting date of 607 BCE for the fall of Jerusalem. This date is so crucial that the organization has declared it a matter of faith rather than historical investigation. Questioning the 607 BCE date has become equivalent to questioning the organization's divine authority, making rational discussion of the evidence extremely difficult for committed members. If Jerusalem actually fell in 587 BCE, as virtually all historians and archaeologists maintain, then adding 2,520 years would bring us to 1934, not 1914. This would mean that the entire 1914 doctrine, along with all the theological superstructure built upon it, is based on a miscalculation. The implications of this possibility are so threatening to the organization's authority that they cannot allow it to be seriously considered. Despite the obvious failures, mathematical errors, and historical problems, 1914 remains alive and central to Jehovah's Witness theology. This persistence demands explanation. How does a prophecy survive when its original predictions failed, its chronological foundation is historically inaccurate, and its ongoing expectations continue to be disappointed? The answer lies in understanding that 1914 is much more than a prophetic calculation. It is the foundation that sustains all the authority of the Watchtower leadership, the organizing principle that gives meaning to the lives of millions of believers, and the theological linchpin that holds together an entire worldview. To abandon 1914 would be to abandon everything that makes Jehovah's Witnesses distinctive as a religious movement. Many faithful Jehovah's Witnesses have built their entire lives around the 1914 doctrine and its implications. They have made educational, career, and family decisions based on the belief that we are living in the final days of a system that began ending in 1914. They have sacrificed opportunities, relationships, and personal fulfillment because they believed the end was imminent. To acknowledge that 1914 was wrong would be to admit that these sacrifices were meaningless and that decades of their lives were based on a mistake. The organization uses the concept of progressive revelation or new light to change the meaning of events without admitting fundamental error. This theological framework allows them to continuously reinterpret failed predictions while maintaining that God is gradually revealing his purposes to his people. Each reinterpretation is presented not as an admission of error, but as evidence of divine guidance and increasing understanding. One of the most significant challenges facing the Jehovah's Witness leadership has been the passage of time itself. Russell had taught that the generation alive in 1914 would not pass away before the end came. This created an implicit deadline that became increasingly problematic as decades passed and that generation began dying off. The organization faced a crisis of credibility as their foundational prophecies seemed to set a time limit that was being exceeded. Their solution has been a series of increasingly complex redefinitions of what constitutes the generation. Originally, it meant people who were alive in 1914 and old enough to understand the significance of the events. When this became untenable as those people died, it was redefined as people who came of age in 1914, presumably having reached some level of maturity by that date. As this group also began dying off, the definition was expanded to include people whose lives overlapped with those who witnessed 1914. Most recently, it has been defined as an overlapping generation that includes anointed Jehovah's Witnesses whose lives overlap with those of the 1914 generation. This latest definition is so convoluted that it essentially removes any meaningful time limit while maintaining the theological significance of the original date. Each redefinition has pushed the expected end date further into the future while preserving the appearance of biblical fulfillment. This demonstrates the lengths to which the organization will go to preserve its foundational doctrine, even when it requires increasingly complex and difficult-to-understand explanations that strain the credulity of thinking members. The persistence of the 1914 doctrine, despite its obvious problems, reveals important insights about the psychology of religious belief and prophetic movements. When deeply held beliefs conflict with observable reality, the human mind has a tendency to protect the beliefs by reinterpreting reality rather than abandoning the beliefs. This psychological mechanism, known as cognitive dissonance, helps explain why prophetic failure often leads to reinterpretation rather than abandonment of faith. People who have invested significant time, energy, resources, and emotional capital in a belief system become reluctant to abandon it, even when evidence strongly suggests they should. This is known as the sunk cost fallacy, and it's particularly powerful in religious contexts where the investment isn't just material but involves one's entire identity and worldview. For many Jehovah's Witnesses, abandoning the 1914 doctrine would mean admitting that decades of their lives, including major sacrifices and missed opportunities, were based on a fundamental mistake. The social cost of questioning core doctrines is also prohibitively high in high-commitment religious groups like Jehovah's Witnesses. Leaving or even seriously questioning the faith involves losing not just religious beliefs, but entire social networks, family relationships, and personal identity. The organization has created a system where questioning fundamental doctrines like 1914 is equivalent to questioning God himself, making intellectual honesty extremely difficult for committed members who risk being shunned by everyone they know and love. The organization has also created an authority structure that makes independent verification of doctrines nearly impossible for most members. They are taught that the organization is God's sole channel of communication on earth, and that attempting to understand biblical prophecy outside of organizational guidance is not just futile but spiritually dangerous. This creates a closed system where the organization's interpretations cannot be seriously challenged without rejecting the entire religious framework. The prophecy of 1914 is not just a date or a calculation. It is a comprehensive strategy of social and psychological control. It serves as a point of doctrinal control that distinguishes true believers from those who might be wavering in their faith. It provides ongoing validation for organizational authority by maintaining that we are living in the special time period that began in 1914. It creates urgency that motivates members to prioritize organizational activities over personal interests and ambitions. The 1914 doctrine also serves as a powerful tool for interpreting world events in ways that consistently validate the organization's worldview. Wars, natural disasters, social problems, and economic difficulties are all interpreted as evidence that we are living in the last days that began in 1914. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where current events seem to provide ongoing confirmation of the doctrine's accuracy, even though the same types of events have been occurring throughout human history. Today, more than a century after Russell's predicted end of the world, the 1914 doctrine remains absolutely central to Jehovah's Witness theology and continues to shape the lives of approximately 8 million active members worldwide. The current teachings that flow from the 1914 doctrine form an interconnected web of beliefs that touches every aspect of a Jehovah's Witness's life and worldview. According to current Watchtower teaching, Christ began ruling as king in heaven in 1914, marking the establishment of God's kingdom in the heavenly realm. This invisible enthronement supposedly fulfilled biblical prophecies about the Messiah's reign, even though it bears no resemblance to the visible, earthly kingdom that most biblical prophecies describe. Satan was cast out of heaven in 1914, leading to increased wickedness, warfare, and turmoil on earth as the devil vents his fury knowing his time is short. The last days began in 1914, making the current period the final era of human history under Satan's rule. This creates a sense of living in a special time that demands special commitment and urgency. The generation that witnessed 1914, as currently redefined through the overlapping generation doctrine, will not pass away before Armageddon brings an end to the current system and establishes God's kingdom on earth. These teachings serve multiple crucial organizational functions that extend far beyond mere theological speculation. The 1914 doctrine provides the foundational justification for the organization's claim to be God's sole channel of communication on earth. According to Watchtower teaching, Christ began using the Bible students, later known as Jehovah's Witnesses, as his earthly representatives starting in 1919, just after his heavenly enthronement in 1914. This creates a direct line of divine authority that flows from Christ through the organization to individual members. By maintaining that we are living in the final period of human history that began in 1914, the organization creates a powerful sense of urgency that motivates members to prioritize religious activities over personal pursuits, education, career advancement, and even family relationships with non-believers. The constant expectation that the end could come at any time discourages long-term planning and encourages complete dependence on organizational guidance for all major life decisions. World events since 1914, including 2 world wars, the Holocaust, nuclear weapons, terrorism, natural disasters, disease outbreaks, and social upheaval, are all interpreted as evidence that the end times began in 1914 and are intensifying as Armageddon approaches. This creates a self-reinforcing interpretive framework where virtually any negative event can be seen as confirmation of the doctrine's accuracy, while positive developments are either ignored or reinterpreted as deceptive signs of false security. The 1914 doctrine also justifies the organization's distinctive practices and separateness from the broader world. Since Satan has been ruling the earth since 1914 with particular fury, engagement with worldly institutions, politics, higher education, and secular culture is portrayed as spiritually dangerous. This isolation makes members more dependent on the organization for social connection, information, and guidance. The story of the 1914 prophecy extends far beyond the specific case of Jehovah's Witnesses and illuminates broader patterns in religious movements, prophetic traditions, and human psychology. The 1914 case provides a textbook example of how religious movements can survive even spectacular prophetic failures through systematic reinterpretation, redefinition of terms, and the creation of unfalsifiable doctrines that can absorb any amount of disconfirming evidence. The flexibility demonstrated in handling the 1914 prophecy shows how religious authorities can maintain control even after their predictions fail by positioning themselves as the sole legitimate interpreters of prophetic meaning. Each failure becomes an opportunity to demonstrate greater spiritual insight and deeper understanding of God's purposes, rather than evidence of human error or deception. The strong social bonds within high-commitment religious communities like Jehovah's Witnesses can override logical inconsistencies and maintain group cohesion even when foundational beliefs are repeatedly challenged by external evidence. The social cost of acknowledging error becomes so high that members find it easier to accept increasingly complex explanations than to question core beliefs. While organizational leaders clearly benefit from maintaining failed doctrines that justify their authority and control, individual believers often pay significant personal costs for their loyalty to prophetic systems that have repeatedly failed. These costs include damaged relationships with family members who leave the faith or never join it, lost educational and career opportunities due to end-times expectations that discourage long-term planning, psychological distress from cognitive dissonance when beliefs conflict with observable reality, and the constant anxiety that comes from living in expectation of an imminent end that never arrives. The 1914 prophecy demonstrates how religious movements can create closed systems of belief that become immune to external verification or falsification. By establishing themselves as the sole authorized interpreters of divine truth, religious authorities can dismiss any evidence that contradicts their teachings while claiming credit for any events that can be interpreted as supportive. In 1914, the world didn't end. The kingdom of God was not established visibly on earth. Human governments were not overthrown by divine intervention. Religious systems were not destroyed by supernatural means. The war that began that year eventually ended, as all human wars do. And life continued much as it always had, with the same mixture of joy and sorrow, progress and setback, hope and disappointment that has characterized human existence throughout history. But for approximately 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide, 1914 still marks the beginning of the end, even though that end has been perpetually postponed for over a century. They continue to organize their lives around a prophetic timetable that has already failed multiple times, sacrificing educational opportunities, career advancement, and personal relationships for an expectation that shows no signs of being fulfilled. The history of this prophecy teaches us profound lessons about the nature of religious authority, the psychology of belief, and the human capacity for self-deception in the face of uncomfortable truths. Not every failed prediction needs to die. Some are recycled, adapted, and eternized, not because they are true, but because they serve powerful psychological and social functions that transcend their original purpose. The flexibility of failed prophecy demonstrates how religious movements can survive even spectacular prophetic failures through systematic reinterpretation, redefinition of key terms, and the creation of theological frameworks that can absorb virtually any amount of disconfirming evidence. The 1914 case shows how a specific, testable prediction can be transformed into an unfalsifiable doctrine that becomes more central to the faith after its failure than it was before. The role of religious authority in maintaining control through failed predictions reveals how central figures can not only survive prophetic failure but actually use it to strengthen their position by positioning themselves as the sole legitimate interpreters of divine truth. Each failure becomes an opportunity to demonstrate greater spiritual insight and deeper understanding, rather than evidence of human error or deception. The power of community and social bonds within high-commitment religious groups shows how strong relationships can override logical inconsistencies and maintain group cohesion even when foundational beliefs are repeatedly challenged by external evidence. The social cost of acknowledging error becomes so high that members find it easier to accept increasingly complex and implausible explanations than to question core beliefs that define their identity and relationships. Yet there is a profound human cost to maintaining these failed doctrines that extends far beyond the organizational benefits they provide to religious leaders. Individual believers pay the price through damaged relationships with family members who cannot accept their faith, lost educational and career opportunities due to end-times expectations that discourage long-term planning, and the psychological distress that comes from trying to maintain beliefs that conflict with observable reality. The 1914 prophecy stands as a testament to several disturbing realities about human nature and religious experience. It demonstrates the power of religious authority to maintain control through failed predictions, showing how leaders can turn prophetic failure into evidence of their unique spiritual insight. It reveals the human capacity for self-deception when faced with uncomfortable truths, particularly when acknowledging error would require fundamental changes in worldview and lifestyle. Most tragically, it illustrates the terrible cost of building one's life on prophetic foundations that were never solid to begin with. Millions of people have organized their entire existence around expectations that have repeatedly failed, sacrificing real opportunities for hypothetical rewards that perpetually recede into an ever-distant future. Perhaps the most disturbing question raised by the 1914 prophecy is how many other religious doctrines and movements are sustained by predictions that never came true, yet continue to guide and control entire lives. How many other failed prophets have successfully transformed their failures into ongoing sources of authority? How many other religious communities are organized around expectations that have already been proven wrong, but continue to demand sacrifice and devotion from their followers? The prophecy of 1914 may have failed in every measurable way, but its power to shape and control lives remains tragically intact more than a century later. It serves as a sobering reminder that truth and power are not always aligned, and that the human need for meaning and certainty can sometimes override the evidence of our own experience. In the end, the greatest tragedy of the 1914 prophecy is not that it failed, but that its failure has been transformed into a tool for perpetual control over millions of lives that could have been lived more freely and fully if not bound by the chains of a prophecy that should have been abandoned long ago.